right. Yeah, Maine. To build.
We're so fortunate to have Dr. Christine Swager, the star of TV, movies, author of any number of books about any number of things. So without any further ado, Dr. Swager, or Chris.
I should leave right now before I ruin my reputation. At the bicentennial in Philadelphia, Queen Elizabeth made this statement: "We lost the American colonies because we lacked the statesmanship to know the time and manner of yielding what it is impossible to keep." And I wondered what she was talking about. So tonight I want to talk about what Parliament was doing during this Revolutionary War in the South. Now there are three main characters to start with. The king, and you all know about King George III. His prime minister, Lord North, who was a fine politician, but he was no wartime leader and he knew it. Tried repeatedly to resign, and the king wouldn't let him because the king didn't like most of the people in Parliament, didn't want to deal with anybody else. Now the third member is Lord Germain. Now as a younger man, he had been in the army, and he was a lieutenant general. That's 3 stars. In France, or in Europe, in 1759, he had been in charge of the cavalry in reserve. And when the commander of the battle, Prince Frederick of Brunswick, ordered the reserves to attack the French flank, Germain refused. And as a result, the French were able to retreat, and the opportunity for the Allied forces to win that battle was lost. Prince Ferdinand obviously was a little bit upset and complained, and the British government stripped Germain of his commission and dismissed him from the military. Now Germain thought, well, he'd do better with British officers, so he asked for a court-martial, and he got it. And they declared him guilty. And they concluded that he was unfit to serve His Majesty in any military capacity whatever. And now, 20 years later, he's the Secretary of the Colonies, and he is running the war for England. How could such a man have such a position? Well, the king wanted to punish the colonists, and Germain had convinced the king that he was the man to do it. Now, if you know about the Northern Campaign, you know he wasn't doing it very well. And he decided that he needed a new strategy, and that strategy was the Southern strategy. And the idea was that they'd bring troops from the north to the south, whip up through the south, and all you loyal civilians would join, and you would hold the peace for the king after the British Army moved forth. And he had a little difficulty getting it through Parliament, but he lied. And he said, basically, if we can take the South, we'll have something positive from this war, even if we have to let the North go. And that appealed to most members of Parliament because their businesses were suffering. And as Stokesbury writes, an empire in North America which consisted of Hudson's Bay, Newfoundland, Quebec, and Nova Scotia in the north, the Atlantic seaboard from the Chesapeake Cape to Florida, and the British West Indies in the south, was not to be despised, and would be a reasonable solution to Britain's difficulties. Feeling the birth pangs of the Industrial Revolution, Britain did not really need the irreconcilably rebellious northern colonies, and might well be better off without them. If the North were lost, so be it. If the South were salvageable, it should be done so. And so Parliament agreed to fund the Southern campaign. Now, it was understood they were running out of money, they were running out of patience. This would be the last major expenditure that Parliament would invest in this miserable war. Now, you know, it started out very well. They had taken Georgia, then they took Charleston, and Clinton moved to establish posts all through the colony from which the British troops could operate, and it would be a rallying point for all you loyal subjects to come and join his militia. And then Clinton thought everything was under control, and he went back to New York. And he left Lord Cornwallis with 4,000 troops. And some advice. First, win the hearts and minds of the people of South Carolina. In other words, all you people he hoped would be loyal subjects to his Royal Majesty, King George III. And secondly, as Cornwallis moved up through Virginia to win this war, he should protect his supply lines. And he went back to New York. Now, Lord Cornwallis was a very ambitious individual, didn't like Clinton, didn't pay much attention to Clinton, and Clinton should have known that winning the hearts and minds of people in South Carolina would not be easy, because Tarleton had already made a reputation for himself at Monk's Corner and the Waxhaws, and then you had people like Dunlap and Christian Huck and Weems, and they treated the settlers with disrespect. And so the whole back country exploded. And George, would you give them an idea of where it exploded?
Well, I would think it was pretty close to where we're sitting.
No, that's not the back country.
You want the real back country?
Yeah, I want my first map, please.
Okay.
And that is the back country. Now, Cornwallis probably lost about 500 men. Was he worried? Not particularly. He was concerned with the Continental Army that was moving down under the command of Horatio Gates. And he met him at Camden. And he won the battle. And decimated the Continental Army, chased them back into North Carolina. So Cornwallis was feeling very, very confident. But what about the second bit of advice? Protect your supply lines. On August the 20th, very close by here, the British troops who were accompanying American prisoners to Charleston were attacked by Francis Marion. And from that point on, the British never controlled their supply lines. And you will see why if you see how widely traveled Francis Marion was. Now, when the word got back to England, Parliament was excited. Lord Cornwallis had won the Battle of Camden, and he was doing just what they expected him to do. He was rolling through the South and on the verge of winning the war. But Cornwallis, confident, now moved to Charlotte. And what got his attention was the Battle of King's Mountain, when militia surrounded Ferguson at King's Mountain, killed Ferguson and many of his men, wounded the rest, and took the rest prisoners. Now, Cornwallis moved from Charlotte back to Winnsboro. And those of us who know our geography know that that's a retreat. But nobody in Parliament, even if they heard about it, understood that that was a retreat. They were convinced that Cornwallis was going into a winter camp, and that made sense. The British always had a winter camp. And so nobody in Parliament was particularly concerned. But Cornwallis would soon meet his match because the Americans now have a new commander in the South. It's Nathaniel Greene. And Nathaniel Greene sent Daniel Morgan out to the western part of the state to spirit up the troops and annoy the enemy. And when William Washington, on New Year's Day, overran Tories at Hammond's Store, and then moved to William's plantation, which was only 15 miles from 96, Lord Cornwallis had to respond. And he would send Tarleton out to destroy Morgan. Now, Stokesbury is a great writer. And he writes, for 10 days in early January, Tarleton first looked for and then chased Morgan, whom he outnumbered 2-1. On January 17, he made the mistake of catching him. And we have the Battle of Cowpens. And again, a disaster for the British. But Parliament never really was concerned about it because Cornwallis wasn't there. And they were following Lord Cornwallis, their great hero. So Cornwallis starts to pursue the Continental Army across North Carolina. And you've got that map. And the Continental Army gets to Virginia. Continental's in blue, with the British in red. And leave Lord Cornwallis in North Carolina, beyond his supply line, suffering from the winter. February in North Carolina can be a little uncomfortable. And Greene realizes, though, that he's got to meet Cornwallis in the field. And so the middle of March, they fight a battle at Guilford Courthouse. And Greene leaves the field, retreats. Cornwallis keeps the field and wins the battle. Now, when the word of Guilford Courthouse reaches Parliament, they're ecstatic. Their hero, Lord Cornwallis, is moving right up through the South and winning this war. But Nathaniel Greene understood what Parliament did not understand. Lord Cornwallis's army was being bled to death. Now, Greene was sort of a micromanager. He paid attention to the little details. Now, Lord Cornwallis had lost about 500 men in those early skirmishes. At the Battle of Camden, which he won, he lost about 1 in 4 of his redcoats, and 800 soldiers were too sick to even make it to the battlefield. And then, at Kings Mountain, he lost 100 troops, 100 British soldiers, provincials, and 900 Tory militia. At Blacksburg, he lost another 100 regulars and provincials. And at Cowpens, he lost a fourth of his army, all of his light infantry. Now, he had been reinforced by General Leslie. But in that trip across North Carolina, Cornwallis lost 17% of his men to death, disease, and desertion. And now he had won at Guilford Courthouse, but he lost a fourth of his army doing it. And what was even worse, he lost about 36 British officers, many of them senior, the backbone of the British Army, killed or wounded. And Greene knew that eventually England was going to have to stop. England could not continue to take the loss of men, material, and money. And if Congress would stay the course, the Americans would eventually win. But when the war was halted, or the hostilities ended, Britain would keep all of the territory it held. It was international law at the time. It's called uti possidetis, as you hold. If the war had ended in March after Guilford Courthouse, Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina would have remained British territory. And you people might be singing God Save the Queen at your the athletic events. Greene understood that he had to take back the territory. And so he does not follow Lord Cornwallis. Greene turns his face to the south and to move back into South Carolina. Up until this point, all the battles here are part of Cornwallis's campaign to take the South. From now on, it will be part of Greene's campaign to take it back. Lord Cornwallis goes to Wilmington, and in Parliament they're not the least bit upset because the poor boy with his victorious army needs to rest and be resupplied. And they have no idea of what is going on behind Lord Cornwallis's lines. And if you give us the next. You know what Greene plans to do. He's going to take the big posts, hope the militia will take the small posts, and he's going to take back as much territory as fast as he can. And he moves toward Camden, and Light Horse Harry Lee and Francis Marion take Fort Watson, and then they take Fort Mott, and Thomas Sumter takes Lawrenceburg. But Greene fails to take Camden, and he loses the Battle of Hawkert Hill. But Lord Rawdon evacuates Camden, and all the territory north of the Santee River, with the exception of Georgetown, and you're going to hear about Francis Marion taking that back eventually. And then he moves over to 96. And 96, under siege. And Lord Rawdon goes to 96, breaks the siege, and then evacuates 96. And while Greene is preoccupied with 96, Lord Cornwallis now starts his campaign up from Wilmington, and he's headed toward Virginia. And Parliament is ecstatic because their hero is once again on the move, and the war is going to be won, they think. The morale is very high in that area, and in the summer of 1781, Lord North's government was again confident and complacent about the war in the colonies. Viewed from London, Lord Cornwallis's year-long march across the South after his victory in Charleston had been like an English knife through colonial butter. Surely it would now be a matter of only a little time before the colonists would come to their senses and call off the rebellion. Greene moves back to the high hills of the Santee, just a little bit north of here. The only British army in the field is just across the Santee River from Clarendon County. And Greene is assembling, he hopes, an army that will finally deal with that British army. Now, Lord Cornwallis and Benedict Arnold and Tarleton are making life difficult for Thomas Jefferson in Virginia. And all of the news from Cornwallis is uplifting, upbeat, everything is going fine. But Greene moves against Eutaw Springs on the 8th of September. And in a bloody battle with 42% casualties for the British, 28% casualties for the Americans, Greene leaves the field and regroups, comes back the next day, and the British are evacuating Eutaw Springs. And so Greene does not attack. He doesn't want more casualties, he wants the territory. And so when he does follow the British Army long enough to be sure that they're headed back for Charleston, and he goes back to the high hills to rest his army without knowing that at that point the French fleet has defeated the British fleet in the Chesapeake Bay And Lord Cornwallis is stranded at a little Virginia town called Yorktown. 5 weeks later, Lord Cornwallis surrenders his troops at Yorktown. Now you might think, as some of our students do, that Yorktown ended the war. Not at all. Now it usually took 6 weeks or more for news to get back to Europe. But a fast French frigate, say that fast, left Yorktown, went directly to France to break the news that the British had been defeated. And Benjamin Franklin in Paris got the news November 19th. That is just 1 month after Yorktown. Now the British didn't get the news until the 26th of November. And Lord Germain, Lord North, and the King consult. 2 days later, Parliament reconvenes. They are astounded. I mean, wasn't Cornwallis winning the war? Well, maybe it's time to quit. However, the King will explain it all. And when the King made his address to Parliament, he never mentioned Cornwallis, and he never mentioned Yorktown. It was business as usual. The war will pursue the war with vigor. The colonists will come to their senses, and we will win and punish the colonists. Did he believe it? Yes, he did. Because Germain had convinced him that if they had a very strong commander for that army that Clinton had in New York that he hadn't used in a year, if they took the field, they could defeat George Washington and still win this war. And Parliament, all of a sudden, was really confused and very upset because they started getting information back from the colonies and from other commanders like Burgoyne and the Howes and Clinton. And they realized that Germain's their problem and they've got to get rid of him. But he has wartime powers. How do you get rid of him? If he won't resign, and he won't resign. For 2 solid months, Parliament did nothing except try to figure out how to get rid of Lord Germain. And what was happening here? Well, the British troops were attacking plantations to feed their troops in Savannah and Charleston. Bloody Bill Cunningham, David Fanning in North Carolina, Thomas Waters and Burnfoot Brown in Georgia were inflicting heavy casualties on the civilian population. And Parliament did nothing. Well, the whole matter got settled when the King decided he wanted a replacement for Clinton, and he named Sir Guy Carleton. And Sir Guy Carleton was arrogant and ambitious, but he also had the impeccable military credentials. Now remember, Germain had been court-martialed, and Carleton held him in utmost contempt. And all through the years, the two of them had been adversaries. And now, with Carleton having the ear of the king and the command of the army in America, Germain knew he was finished. So he did resign and took a seat in the House of Lords. When he showed up, there were catcalls, boos, condemnation, but he was not a man of great sensitivity, as you know. So he took his seat. The king now realizes that he's going to lose the colonies, and he writes a letter of abdication. And because he couldn't face losing part of his empire, Lord North talks him out of it. But Lord North lost his government in February. And the new government finally, it's the Whigs, the people who had opposed the war all the time. They formed a government. And their prime minister was Rockingham. And the king despised him, wouldn't meet with him. And so how do you form a government without a session with the king. Well, this took some more time, and finally they came to a compromise. The Earl of Shelburne would become the go-between and convey information back and forth between the Prime Minister and the king. Now, once the government was formed, the first order of business was to send Carleton to this country, not to continue the war, but to remove all British troops from the colonies. And also, if he could, to approach the Congress about a peace deal. Well, he was not able to do that. And Prime Minister Rockingham and Shelburne were determined that this war had to end. And they started to plot of how it could be done, and then Rockingham died in a flu epidemic the first day of July. And that left Shelburne. Now, Shelburne is a bright individual who had followed the war in opposition to it and was very well informed on what had happened. He was determined to make peace with the Americans because until that was settled, he couldn't make peace with France and Spain, and their navies were threatening the sugar islands. They had to have a treaty with the Americans. Now, Congress had agreed to let France do their negotiating for them and had given that word to Benjamin Franklin, who was in Paris. And so for a while, very little was done. But Shelburne was determined. He was have a peace treaty. And he also knew that any peace treaty would establish these colonies as independent. And that was a given at this point. And, but he knew Parliament wouldn't hold still for that. And the king and the former king's government, wartime government, they were still sitting in Parliament. They still wanted to punish the colonists. He knew that he could not depend on Parliament to do it. Because if Parliament got involved, it would be months, maybe years, before it was settled. So Shelburne dismissed Parliament and decided that he would negotiate himself. He sent his representative over to France, and Benjamin Franklin had been determined not to discuss anything, not to meet with the British, because that's what the French wanted. But Providence sort of stepped in, and Franklin had kidney stones. And with his chronic gout and his kidney stones, he was confined to his bed. And the representative met with John Jay. And John Jay's attitude was, let the French dictate the terms for America, not on your life. And so Jay first wanted to establish, we are an independent nation. You are not dealing with separate colonies, you are dealing with the United States of America. And Shelburne understood that, not a problem. And then, if you show the next map, England, France, and Spain assumed that if the colonies were independent, that they would have the same form that they already had. And that meant that the western boundary would be the Appalachian Mountains. And Jay said, absolutely not. We will have the territory clear to the Mississippi River and the right to navigate on the Mississippi River, and which now is the shaded area, clear through there. And the British representative explains to him that that won't be acceptable to Spain and France. They had their eye on that territory. And Jay says, if that line is insisted upon, it is needless to talk peace. And the British collapsed accepted that. And what I find even more amazing, when he said the Great Lakes will be the upper region, that meant that Shelburne was giving away part of Canada. And he did. It took another 80 years to get that treaty straightened out with the Canadian border, but the British backed down. Then John Adams arrived, and he's a New Englander, and he says, we want fishing rights on the Grand Banks. That's clearly the territory that belongs to Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and Labrador. And the British pointed that out, and he said, well, the French are fishing there, and we're closer than the French are. And the British backed down. Now, when Franklin comes back, he realizes that he can't trust the French, and he enters into secret negotiations. And by the end of the summer and the fall, the Americans are prepared with 9 conditions. The information is conveyed to Shelburne. And again, Parliament's still in session, not out of session, but coming back soon. Shelburne knows that the Americans' attitude is take it or leave it, and Parliament will soon be back in session, and he doesn't want them involved, and he has them sign it. And the 25th of November of 1782, a year after Yorktown, they meet in Paris and they sign. And they sign in alphabetical order, which pleased John Adams. Because it goes John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, and then Henry Lawrence, who had joined at the very, very end. Shelburne was a brilliant politician, and he made sure that the British signed it in the name of the King's government. And 2 days later, Parliament came back in session, and the King addressed them, reading a speech that Shelburne had written for him. And out of consideration of the King's feelings, he only had to say the word independence once. But the King outlined the conditions, and Parliament went crazy. I mean, hadn't we defeated these people? Why aren't we punishing them? What do you mean we're giving them fishing rights and all of that territory? The King was on a vitriolic tirade. Lord North renounced the treaty, and even people of Shelburne's own party were upset because they had no intention of letting the colonists secede from the British Empire. They didn't want the war, but they didn't want to lose the colonies either, so they were unhappy. And Parliament then recesses for Christmas. Over Christmas, Shelburne negotiated peace treaties with France and Spain. He didn't make it to Holland, but that was a minor thing. And so when Parliament came back after Christmas, Shelburne thought, surely he could survive, because England is now at peace for the first time in 8 years. He settled the American situation, France and Spain. Why wouldn't they be happy about all of this? Well, when Parliament came back, they were even more upset than when they left. And to make matters worse, Lord North, who had been head of the Tory government, and Charles James Fox, who was one of the leading opponents of the war, agreed to form a coalition government. The two of those people had been enemies for years. They hated each other, but they were willing to unite to scrap that treaty. The King was a little upset, but Shelburne was gone. And this coalition government was determined that they could do better. They soon found they couldn't, because Shelburne had been sure that the conditions had been signed, in the name of the king's government. So North and Fox wasted another 6 months, and then, finally, in September, the Second Treaty of Paris was signed, ending the war, almost 2 years after Yorktown. Now, Benjamin Franklin wrote to a friend, "We are all friends with England and all mankind. May we never see another war. For in my opinion, there never was a good war or a bad peace." Now, why was Parliament so furious with Shelburne? He had really committed political suicide. Well, part of it was partisan politics. Those two sides were never going to agree on anything anyway. But it was even more than that. It was a lack of information. Remember, it took 6 weeks, 8 weeks to get any written word back across by sailing ship. And the information was pretty sparse. And they also had been fed a lot of propaganda. Remember, most people in Parliament still thought Lord Cornwallis had swept through the South in a series of victories. Well, the poor boy lost his army at Yorktown, but hadn't he taken the South? Hadn't he conquered all of that territory? And why were we giving it up? We know that while Cornwallis was moving north, Greene was moving south. And so Yorktown might have been a wake-up call, but it was the strategic win at Utah Springs that allowed the Americans to negotiate from a position of strength. And because Shelburne understood what had happened, he realized that he was making the best deal he could possibly make. Now, the poet wrote, "At Utah Springs, the bandit died. Their bones with dust are covered o'er. Weep on, ye springs, your tearful tide. How many heroes are no more? If in this wreck of ruin they can yet be thought to claim a tear, O smite thy gentle breast and say, the friends of freedom slumber here." I would suggest to you tonight that the poet might have finished that line, "The founders of our freedom slumber here at Utah Springs."
That concludes our program for this evening. Certainly appreciate everybody coming, sharing with us, and one Christine Grace.
Yeah.